They are some of the most popular and flashy TV evangelists in the country. These men appear to have made a lot of money, and they travel, well, like kings. When our Lisa Guerrero tried to ask one of these wealthy preachers about that, some might say she was treated in a very non-Christian way.
Few modern religious figures have lived as publicly and as polarizingly as Kenneth Copeland, a televangelist whose voice, image, and message have circulated for decades across television networks, megachurch stages, and now viral internet clips. That level of visibility has built him a global following and a multi-million-dollar ministry footprint. But it has also ensured that every controversy, criticism, and out-of-context moment is amplified far beyond its original setting. Now, at 89, Kenneth Copeland has finally confirmed the rumors. This is one roller coaster ride you just can't miss. The private jet empire and the demons on commercial flights controversy. By the late 2010s, Kenneth Copeland Ministries, headquartered near Fort Worth in Tarrant County, Texas, had assembled an aviation fleet that included several ministry-owned aircraft. What had once been a niche criticism among watchdog groups suddenly exploded into a national controversy. The story had been building for decades. Copeland, born in 1936 in Lubbock, Texas, rose from a small ministry founded in 1967 into one of the largest prosperity gospel organizations in the world. As the ministry expanded internationally, aircraft became central to its operations. Supporters argued that private aviation allowed Copeland and ministry staff to reach multiple destinations quickly, conduct overseas missions, and maintain demanding travel schedules. Critics saw something different. They pointed to luxury business jets that looked less like missionary tools and more like the transportation choices of Fortune 500 executives. Public scrutiny intensified in 2015 when Copeland appealed to supporters for help acquiring a new aircraft. The target was a Gulfstream 5, a long-range business jet capable of flying thousands of miles without refueling. The aircraft had previously belonged to filmmaker and media entrepreneur Tyler Perry. New Gulfstream 5 jets had originally sold for tens of millions of dollars, and even used examples remained extremely expensive. Copeland presented the purchase as an opportunity to expand global ministry operations. To critics, however, the request reinforced concerns that donor money was supporting an increasingly luxurious lifestyle. Then came the interview that changed everything. In June 2019, Inside Edition correspondent Lisa Guerrero confronted Copeland on camera about his aircraft fleet. The exchange lasted only a few minutes, but it became one of the most widely viewed televangelist interviews of the internet era. Guerrero questioned whether a preacher needed private jets when commercial airlines already connected virtually every major city on Earth. The questions were straightforward. The responses were not. Copeland defended the aircraft vigorously. He argued that commercial travel presented challenges for ministry work and cited concerns about maintaining focus. During the discussion, he also referenced what he had previously described in sermons as the negative spiritual environment encountered on commercial flights. One phrase in particular captured public attention. Copeland had spoken in earlier remarks about avoiding what he called a tube full of demons, a description that instantly became viral once clips circulated online. Millions of viewers shared the footage. The reaction was immediate. News organizations, comedians, bloggers, and social media users seized on the phrase. Late-night television programs mocked the comments. Memes spread across Facebook, X, Reddit, and YouTube. Yet the controversy was larger than one awkward phrase. Financial transparency advocates argued that the aircraft symbolized a broader issue within the prosperity gospel movement. Ministries such as Copeland's received donations from supporters ranging from wealthy business people to retirees living on fixed incomes. Critics questioned whether contributions intended for religious work should finance luxury transportation. Defenders countered that churches and ministries routinely own vehicles, buildings, and equipment necessary for their missions. Additional scrutiny followed reports that the Gulfstream 5 would require substantial modifications before entering ministry service. Aviation publications and watchdog groups highlighted discussions about upgrades, maintenance expenses, and operational costs that could run into millions of dollars. Even after purchase, private jets require highly trained crews, insurance, hangar space, fuel, and extensive maintenance programs. Long-range business aircraft can cost thousands of dollars per flight hour to operate. The irony was that Copeland was hardly the first televangelist to own aircraft. Throughout the late 20th century, several prominent television ministries operated private planes. What made Copeland different was timing. The Inside Edition interview arrived during an era when smartphones, social media, and viral video could turn a brief exchange into a global news event within hours. Previous generations might have read a newspaper article about ministry finances. Millions now watched the confrontation directly, replaying every facial expression and every answer. Even years later, the demons on commercial flights controversy remains a defining episode. But wait, we're only beginning our descent into the rabbit hole, the Senate investigation into Kenneth Copeland Ministries. In November 2007, Chuck Grassley, then the ranking Republican on the Senate Finance Committee, launched an inquiry into 6 of America's most prominent televangelist organizations. Among them was Kenneth Copeland Ministries, headquartered near Fort Worth, Texas. The investigation began with a simpler but politically explosive question. How were tax-exempt religious organizations using the millions of dollars flowing into their ministries each year? The inquiry immediately placed Kenneth Copeland under a spotlight, unlike anything he had previously faced. By that point, Copeland had spent decades building one of the world's largest prosperity gospel ministries. His broadcasts reached numerous countries, his books sold widely, and his organization operated from a sprawling campus at Eagle Mountain Lake in Tarrant County. To supporters, this represented the success of a growing international ministry. To critics, it raised questions about whether charitable donations were funding lifestyles more commonly associated with corporate executives than religious leaders. Grassley's staff began requesting detailed records. The questions were extensive and unusually specific. Investigators sought information on ministry finances, executive compensation, housing arrangements, travel expenses, ministry-owned vehicles, aircraft operations, and luxury assets. Rather than focusing solely on Kenneth Copeland personally, Senate investigators examined the broader organizational structure surrounding the ministry. As documents and reports emerged, attention quickly turned toward real estate. News organizations highlighted reports of large homes connected to televangelist ministries. Questions arose about ownership structures, maintenance costs, and whether certain properties served ministry purposes or personal ones. Because churches generally enjoy exemptions from filing the detailed public tax forms required of many other nonprofits, outsiders often have limited visibility into how assets were classified. That lack of transparency became a central theme of the investigation. The ministry's aviation operations also attracted attention. Long before Copeland's private jet controversies exploded across social media, Senate investigators were already examining ministry aircraft usage. Private aviation represented one of the most expensive categories of ministry spending. Aircraft acquisition, maintenance, fuel, insurance, crew salaries, and hangar costs could amount to millions of dollars over time. Investigators wanted to understand how aircraft were being used, who authorized flights, and whether travel primarily served ministry objectives. As months turned into years, the inquiry became a national debate. Unlike publicly traded corporations, churches operate under a unique legal framework in the United States. The Internal Revenue Service generally avoids extensive oversight of religious organizations unless specific legal concerns arise. Advocates for reform argued that some ministries had effectively become large financial enterprises while remaining shielded from the reporting requirements imposed on secular nonprofits. Religious freedom advocates countered that increased government oversight could create dangerous precedents and infringe upon constitutional protections. Kenneth Copeland Ministries responded by defending its operations and challenging the scope of the Senate inquiry. The ministry argued that it had complied with applicable laws and that government investigators were venturing into areas protected by religious liberty. The dispute was not merely about accounting records, it evolved into a broader confrontation over where government oversight should end. and religious autonomy should begin. That constitutional dimension ensured the story remained in headlines far beyond the usual religious press. One of the most controversial developments emerged when Senate staff later indicated that not all ministries had responded equally to requests for information. In reports summarizing the inquiry, Kenneth Copeland Ministries was among the organizations cited as being less cooperative than investigators had hoped. Meanwhile, the inquiry generated significant public discussion about prosperity theology itself, wealth, prosperity gospel, and claims of exploiting faith. The controversy surrounding Kenneth Copeland was never really about airplanes, mansions, or even money by themselves. At its core, it was about an idea. Few religious concepts in modern America have generated more debate than the prosperity gospel, and few figures have become more closely associated with it than Kenneth Copeland. Beginning in the 1970s and accelerating through the television boom of the 1980s, Copeland emerged as one of the movement's most influential voices, preaching to audiences that eventually stretched across North America, Europe, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. His message was straightforward but powerful. Faith was not merely spiritual. It could affect health, success, finances, and everyday life. The foundation of Copeland's teaching rested on what supporters often call faith principles, or positive confession. Drawing heavily from biblical passages such as Mark 11:23 and 2 Corinthians 9:6, he taught that words carried spiritual power and that believers should speak victory rather than defeat. In Copeland's view, faith was not passive belief, but an active force capable of producing tangible results. His books, television broadcasts, conferences, and sermons repeatedly emphasized that Christians should expect God's blessings in practical areas of life, including finances. For followers struggling through recessions, debt, layoffs, or economic uncertainty, the message carried enormous appeal. By the 1980s, Kenneth Copeland Ministries had transformed from a relatively small Texas-based ministry into a global religious enterprise. The organization's headquarters near Eagle Mountain Lake in Tarrant County, Texas, expanded into a large ministry campus. Television programs reached millions of households through Christian broadcasting networks. Conferences attracted thousands of attendees. Publications, teaching materials, and fundraising campaigns became central parts of ministry operations. As revenues grew, so did public curiosity about how the organization managed its resources. Critics argued that the prosperity gospel contained a built-in financial tension. Donations, they said, were often presented not merely as acts of generosity, but as spiritual seeds that could produce future blessings. Figures like Kenneth Copeland and others in the prosperity movement consistently emphasize that donations are not payments to God, but acts of faith. Copeland has often taught variations of the idea that giving is a spiritual seed. Critics, however, argue that the line between encouragement and expectation can blur in real-world interpretation. Religious scholar Kate Bowler, who has extensively studied prosperity theology, notes in her work, Blessed, A History of the American Prosperity Gospel, that the movement often promises that God will return financial blessing to those who give with faith, a framing critics say can be interpreted as implied return on investment spirituality rather than pure voluntary charity. In media investigations over the years, including CBS News reporting on prosperity preaching, watchdog analysts have repeatedly raised concern that audiences may internalize the message as a pathway to material improvement tied to giving patterns, rather than purely spiritual discipline. The concern becomes more pointed when paired with economic vulnerability. In the United States, for example, the Federal Reserve has reported that a large share of households lack emergency savings sufficient to cover even a $400 unexpected expense. Against that backdrop, critics argue that messaging that connects giving with promised blessings may land differently for financially stressed individuals than for affluent donors. This is where skepticism tends to sharpen, not in the theological claim that generosity matters, but in the perceived suggestion that financial return, whether framed as breakthrough, harvest, or blessing, is spiritually linked to monetary contribution. During economic downturns, this debate tends to intensify significantly. After the 2008 financial crisis, U.S. charitable giving initially declined, with Giving USA reporting a drop of roughly 7% in total donations in 2009. Similar patterns appeared during the COVID-19 economic shock in 2020, when unemployment in the United States briefly spiked to around 14.7% in April 2020, according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. In such periods, critics argue that appeals for continued or increased giving can appear especially controversial, even if framed as spiritual encouragement rather than obligation. Defenders of prosperity ministries push back strongly on the idea that giving is ever portrayed as compulsory or guaranteed to produce financial return. They argue that churches and ministries across denominations encourage tithing as a long-standing biblical practice, independent of prosperity theology. In their view, giving is positioned as voluntary participation in religious mission work, not a financial contract. Many ministries also emphasize operational realities. Maintaining broadcast networks, international outreach programs, humanitarian aid projects, and large-scale events requires sustained funding, often from donor bases rather than commercial revenue. There is also a structural point that complicates the guaranteed return interpretation. Studies on charitable behavior, including work from the National Bureau of Economic Research, show donor motivations are varied: religious belief, community identity, and moral duty, rather than simple expectations of financial return. Large-scale data does not indicate a consistent pattern of donors expecting measurable profit from religious giving, and U.S. law treats such donations as voluntary gifts without guaranteed returns. However, critics argue prosperity language like seed faith can be misinterpreted under financial stress. Attention also grew around Kenneth Copeland's visible wealth, including reports of aircraft, large properties, and ministry infrastructure. Investigative stories frequently contrasted images of luxury assets with the circumstances of average supporters. In a media environment increasingly focused on inequality and corporate excess, the optics proved difficult to ignore. Former ministry insiders and religious watchdog groups added further scrutiny. Organizations dedicated to monitoring televangelists examined financial disclosures, public statements, and ministry operations. Some critics argued that ministries built around charismatic personalities risked concentrating too much influence in the hands of a single leader. Others questioned compensation structures and governance systems. Because churches enjoy broad tax protections and are generally exempt from filing the same public financial reports as many nonprofits, obtaining detailed information often proved difficult. That lack of transparency became a recurring theme in criticism. COVID-19, faith healing, and pandemic backlash. By early 2020, Kenneth Copeland had already spent decades navigating criticism over prosperity theology, private jets, and ministry finances. Yet nothing in his long career prepared him for the collision between a global pandemic and the modern internet. Through broadcasts from his ministry headquarters near Fort Worth, Texas, he delivered a series of sermons and prayer events declaring spiritual victory over the virus. Drawing upon faith-healing traditions that had long influenced charismatic Christianity, he argued that believers should respond with faith rather than fear. During a televised broadcast in late March 2020, Copeland dramatically addressed the virus directly. Speaking into the camera, he rebuked COVID-19 and symbolically blew against it, declaring its power broken. The footage lasted only moments, but in the age of social media, moments can become immortal. The timing made the reaction especially intense. At the very moment hospitals in cities such as New York, Milan, Madrid, and London were struggling with surging caseloads, viewers watched a wealthy televangelist appear to combat a deadly virus through spiritual declarations. Public frustration was amplified by grim statistics. By the end of 2020, COVID-19 had killed more than 1.8 million people worldwide. The United States alone would eventually record over 1 million deaths linked to the virus. Against those numbers, critics argued that symbolic gestures risked minimizing the seriousness of the crisis. News outlets quickly picked up the story. Comedy programs featured the clips repeatedly. Social media users created parodies and remixes. Internet culture transformed Copeland's declarations into memes viewed tens of millions of times. Some edits inserted dramatic sound effects, movie scenes, or fictional battle sequences. But beyond the memes, this kind of messaging had done serious damage. Public health research shows that influential messaging can indirectly shape outcomes by affecting behavior at scale. During the pandemic, the United States exceeded 1 million recorded deaths, largely driven by transmission patterns, healthcare system strain, and the timing of vaccination rather than individual media personalities. Studies in journals such as The Lancet and BMJ linked vaccine hesitancy and delayed care to higher hospitalization and mortality, especially in communities with low institutional trust. With COVID-19's basic reproduction number estimated between 2 and 3, even small behavioral changes significantly impacted spread. High-visibility religious broadcasts, including Copeland's 2020 viral remarks, highlighted how messaging can influence public perception during emergencies. But the controversies did not end here. During the economic shock of early 2020, when U.S. unemployment briefly spiked, millions of households were forced into financial uncertainty as businesses shut down and savings were depleted. In that environment, prosperity-focused ministries, including Kenneth Copeland's, continued encouraging tithes and donations. Supporters argued that churches still needed operational funding for broadcasting, outreach, and staffing, while critics viewed continued financial appeals as ethically uncomfortable during a period when many Americans were relying on stimulus checks and unemployment benefits to survive. A similar dynamic had already appeared earlier in 2013 during the measles outbreak linked to Eagle Mountain International Church in Texas. Associated with Copeland's broader ministry network, health officials confirmed clusters of measles cases among church members in Tarrant County, with a significant portion of infected individuals reported as unvaccinated. The outbreak required urgent containment because measles, one of the most contagious viruses known, can remain airborne for up to 2 hours and spread rapidly through exposed populations. Within days, health officials traced hundreds of contacts and launched vaccination drives as epidemiologists studied how community beliefs might affect vaccine uptake. Although it was ultimately contained without major fatalities, the event was significant because measles had been declared eliminated in the United States in 2000, making the 2013 resurgence a warning of how quickly that status can be lost. Broader discussions also emerged around media influential ministries, with critics questioning whether prosperity-focused messaging may pressure vulnerable followers or conflict with public health guidance during crises. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.